very much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here today. It's almost never fun to be the guy from Washington, because regardless of your particular political persuasion, I can guarantee you most of you don't like Washington. It's actually one of the broader themes of Washington, which I'll walk through. It was also mentioned that I do some work for a number of you through your membership with ACMA. And that I've spent time on the Hill with a lot of you with ACMA. And I want to make two preliminary comments. One, the engagement when you actually go to Washington, which I know isn't the most fun place to go, is really, really important. No one can tell the stories about these issues like you can. So I encourage all of you to engage in these issues and to do it through groups like ACMA. There are many trade associations in the world. I know that they do a tremendous job promoting industries. What is remarkable to me about ACMA, and I know Paul's here, Paul, stand up and wave your hand, pat yourself in the back. They are solely focused on those policy issues from my perspective, and it makes a tremendous difference. So with that nice stuff out of the way, let's talk about Washington, the worst place in the world. So it's important to understand kind of as a level set where we are right now. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in the last election. So these are the final numbers. If you're a Republican in the room, you really liked the election. If you're a Democrat, you hated it. The Republicans shouldn't feel that great. This is actually not very far out of the historical norm. If your party has the White House, by the time you get to that third midterm election, people are usually pretty sick of you and anyone with the same initial after their name, right? So I was a Bush guy. We saw what happened to Republicans after 6 years of George Bush. Now the same thing's happening to President Obama and his party. But obviously, Republicans are now running the show. Most people in civics class learned about things like the census and redistricting, and I'm here to tell you everything you learned was a lie. Not intentionally, your teacher actually thought government worked that way. I'm just here to tell you it doesn't. Here's how redistricting actually works. So every 10 years we have a census, and after that census they get a bunch of numbers about who lives where, and they then reapportion every seat in Congress. So the idea is, under perfect representation, we would accurately reflect the population and population shifts. If that was true, it would be fairly unlikely that Democrats would represent only 14% of the landmass in this country and more than 50% of the people, right? These days, the demographics of redistricting do not favor the Democratic Party. So here's how it actually works, just as a kickoff to make you really cynical. So let's pretend that we are a state legislature and I'm the governor of our state. So we get the numbers, we actually draw the lines for Congress. And notwithstanding that in this mythical state, 60% of us are Republicans and 40% are Democrats, we actually, for the most part, like each other. In fact, what we really want to do is make sure that we get to come back, because we actually like these political jobs that we had. So we're going to take all these new voters and we're going to cut them up on little lines that make sure that all the Democrats and all the Republicans get a few more Democrat and Republican voters, except for a couple of people. And regardless of party, we just don't like those people. We think they're jerks. Because human interaction is human interaction in politics and business and sports and anything else. So we're going to make sure that, Paul, I'm going to pick on you, that Paul doesn't get to come back, no matter what. So we're going to take all the voters in Paul's district. The problem now, because John Boehner's the speaker, whoever the next Democratic speaker is, they will have the same problem, because those tools have been taken away. Within the Democratic Party, there's incredible division for a different reason, and that is there is this new populism that is sweeping the Democratic Party. So, and we'll talk about Mrs. Clinton in 2016 a little while, but you really do have a generation gap and a policy gap that is tearing the party apart. And it's going to play itself out in 2016. It is remarkable that Senator Clinton is now, Secretary Clinton, I'm not sure what it was called, is now viewed by many within the party as old and out of touch with the Democratic base. If I'm a 25-year-old Democratic voter, the Clinton years are not even in my memory. I have no reference point at all. So it's just not that interesting to me, and she therefore becomes part of the problem, not part of the new solution. So you have this incredible political divide that we haven't seen in the Democratic Party since Ted Kennedy ran against Jimmy Carter in the primary. I mentioned These folks are inexperienced. They're also new. Literally, at the leadership level, 50% of the leadership slots in Congress are brand new. Completely new people. They do not know. It's not that they don't know what they're doing. It's they've never done it before. Which again gets back to you need to go talk to them and tell them why your issues matter. So if you're a Republican, you love this last Senate race. Republicans obviously picked up the Senate. It had very little to do with how good Republicans are and everything to do with the fact that a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. And it just so happened that the third that was up was really hard for Democrats. There was a lot of Democrats in states that they don't do very well in at the statewide level. So 2016, the math flips completely and Republicans are the ones with all these seats up and it looks very dire. It goes without saying that the presidential race has started. Anyone who saw Mrs. Clinton's press conference the other day knows that wasn't really about email. It was about whether she gets to be president of the United States. One of the ways that we track how many people are running is how many politicians write books that none of you will actually read. I've worked for a number of politicians, and the surest sign that your boss is thinking about running for president is A, they want to go to Iowa or New Hampshire in January. They're both lovely places, but not in January. Number one. Number two, they decide they want to write a book and tell everyone how awesome they are. My old boss, Bill Frist, who I love dearly, but I'm going to give him a hard time, he also wrote a number of books when he was thinking about running for president, and one was about his family, and it was called, you can actually buy this book on Amazon, it's called Good People Beget Good People. And I remember when I heard that title, I said, that's the worst book title I've ever heard. That is like a multi-generational, look how awesome I am, and I'm not sure that's a platform that you can use to run for president. So lots of people are running and the race has already started. On the Republican side, it is truly wide open and I'll tell you why. Republicans and Democrats pick their presidents very differently. So I'll start with the Republicans. If you want to run for president as a Republican and win our nomination, there's a very clear way to do it. You have to run, you have to come in second, you have to support the ultimate nominee and fight the good fight, and then wait your turn. We will do that even if we know for a fact that you're not going to win. So my first presidential campaign was Bob Dole in '96. I love Bob Dole. I worked really hard on that campaign. We knew pretty much the day we were hired we weren't going to win. So why did we nominate Bob Dole? Because it was Bob Dole's turn. Why did we nominate John McCain? Because it was John McCain's turn. Why did we nominate Mitt Romney? Because it was Mitt Romney's turn. There's only one time in modern history we have done something different, and that was 2000, when we nominated George W. Bush, who had not run before, but was the son of the last sitting Republican president, which is the most Republican thing you can do. None of those models apply to this map right now. None of these people are the obvious heir apparent under any traditional measure of how we pick presidents. Now, Democrats actually do it very differently. If you're a Democrat and you want to run, it is truly one and done. Now, you can run a number of times and not get the nomination and keep coming back. But if you get the nomination and do not win, they do not want to see you on that stage again. And the most concrete, hardcore example of that was Al Gore. So many people still really feel Al Gore won the presidency in 2000 and that people like me went to Florida and stole it. I'll disagree on the substance, but on the Republican side, if you were that person, I guarantee you would have walked to the nomination next time. We would have handed it to you and said, it is truly your turn. So 4 years after Al Gore may or may not have won the presidency, how many Democrats were clamoring for Al Gore to show up at some fish fry in Iowa? None. He was gone. They didn't want to hear about him ever again. It is a truly different model. So this time, everyone says, well, it's Hillary. And it's inevitable. It was kind of inevitable last time, but then this weird thing happened with Obama, so this time, it's really inevitable. And I spend an embarrassing amount of time looking at polling numbers. Her polling numbers, and I'll do pre-email polling numbers, are insane. They're not human. They're 90% numbers. You poll Republicans about Hillary, and leaving aside those who just really don't like anyone named Clinton, there are a shocking number of Republican women who were like, I'm not telling anyone this, but I'm voting for Hillary just 'cause. So her numbers are truly amazing. So then this happens. Now, I'm going to say two things that sound contradictory. Number one, this is a really big deal. This is not just a 2-day story. This is going to drag on for a really long time. There are a number of things that can happen to you as a politician when you're running for office. As scandals go, you want scandals that people can relate to and that people can understand or not understand relatively quickly and kind of move on. So this story, on the other hand, no one really understands why she had to do what she did. Her press conference, leaving aside any partisanship, was not very well done. It raised a whole lot of other issues. And because Republicans control Congress, we can now drag those issues out over and over and over and over again. And the more facts that come out, it gets even worse. So today's was, well, apparently Bill Clinton bought the server with his own cash. Okay, great. That's fine. That means we can now subpoena Bill Clinton and be like, hey, Bill, where'd you buy the server? Did you go to Best Buy? Which closet did you put it in? Where is the server now? We want the server. There will be lawsuits. It will be a mess. And what ultimately comes out of it, in a way, is irrelevant, but it leaves this very nasty taste in people's mouths that can't these people ever just exist without there being some hideous mess all the time? And some partisans will say, yeah, it's because there's this amazing Democratic candidate and a Republican attack machine that lies in wait, trolling her, and has her entire life the vast right-wing conspiracy. I gotta be honest, this one's fairly self-made. There was a really easy way to do this. It's called hillary.clinton@state.us.gov. She did this the worst possible way, and it is going to leave a mark. Now, that being said, and I told you this is contradictory, she's still going to be the nominee. So how is that possible? So the first thing you have to ask is, who is there to challenge her? And as a practical matter, the Democratic bench is in really bad shape these days. Now, one of the reasons it's in bad shape these days is because everyone has spent the last 2 years thinking Hillary is inevitable. This happened once before, interestingly, 1992. Bill Clinton, I don't know if folks remember this, 1990, people weren't sitting around thinking the next Democrat who's going to be in the White House is Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. No one knew who he was, and those who did remembered him only as giving like a 5-hour speech at the Democratic convention. So how did that happen? So everyone thought Mario Cuomo was going to be the guy. He had given this amazing speech at a convention 4 years before that, and everyone loved him, and he was really popular, and he was going to run. So a whole lot of people who were much better known and better positioned than Bill Clinton said, I'm not doing it. Because the Cuomo machine will cut me up one side and down the other and leave me for dead, and I'll never get elected to anything ever again. So they didn't do anything. Clinton, frankly, had nothing to lose and said, I'm in. And then when Cuomo didn't run, he was able to run away with it. So this time, with the exception of Martin O'Malley, anyone know Martin O'Malley? The former governor of Maryland, who was once considered a real rising star. Some of the sheen has come off of him because his predecessor got shellacked, his Democratic predecessor got shellacked, and a Republican won the governorship in an overwhelmingly Democratic state, which generally tells political operatives, if you're not that strong in your own state, maybe you shouldn't try and do it in the other 49. That's number one. Number two is Elizabeth Warren. She is wildly popular. I do not believe she is running. She has told everyone under the sun she's not running, and even though all politicians say that, I kind of believe her, because she's not doing most of the things you would actually need to have already done if you wanted to run for president. Now, if Hillary blows up to the point where she actually herself says, I'm not running, Elizabeth Warren will run for president. I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. Hillary has worked longer than anyone in this room at almost anything to be president of the United States. Barring terminal injury, political or otherwise, she is going to run. And no scandal about what email she deleted is going to dissuade her from that, nor is anyone on the Democratic left going to be able to beat her. The only other announced candidate is Bernie Sanders. Some of you may be from Vermont. Bernie is there you go. Bernie is he caucuses with the Democrats, but he's a socialist. I say that not as a slight. He's affirmatively a socialist. He says, I'm a member of the Socialist Party. I'm pretty sure we're not electing a socialist president of the United States right now, so I'm going to stick with Hillary. But you are going to have this total free-for-all on the Republican side, which will mean there are somewhere between 14 and 16 wildly dysfunctional white guys standing on a stage, pounding on each other, and one or two halfway reasonable people who are embarrassed to even be there. And by the time it's done, the one or two people who were fairly normal, everyone thinks you're insane too, because you're even on the stage with these other guys, and it's very hard to win. So that being said, notwithstanding that I'm a Republican political operative and have worked on a number of presidential campaigns, I still think Hillary is going to be the next president. This could go horribly south, this email thing, but generally speaking, I think Hillary's going to be president. Okay. So that's what's going on in Washington in campaign land. Now I'm going to talk about some policy issues that you all care about, where they stand, and what you need to do if you want to make them come out differently. So number one is postal reform. I think there's probably the vast majority of people in here who care about postal reform. Postal reform is really hard to get done. When you talk about constituencies in Washington and fights over large policy issues, anything involving the word reform, and then you throw in things like organized labor, it gets really, really, really hard. Now, the good news, the postmaster really wants a deal because we need postal reform, or things are going to get even more dysfunctional, and more of the cost of that dysfunction will be pushed off on people in this room. So we are for something, and the current postmaster is for something, and that's a good thing. There has been more bipartisan discussion over postal reform in this last Congress than there has been recently, including actual markups. Now, unfortunately, they fell apart over stupid, unrelated issues like whether you're allowed to have a gun in the trunk of your car while you're in the parking lot of a post office. But bear in mind, that had nothing to do with actual postal reform and everything to do with making the other guys look bad just before an election. So I'm somewhat encouraged at not only the postmaster and the fact that there is bipartisan discussion, but that we are continuing to move the ball. You all need to talk about that issue, not amongst yourselves. You need to talk to policymakers about the issue. You need to do it in your individual capacity, in your company capacity, through groups like ACMA. You need to do it a lot and keep doing it. Because when you talk about people who care about postal reform, there's like 240,000 people who wear gray shorts and knee socks to work all day, and believe me, they talk about this issue with everyone they can. So you all need to talk about this issue from your perspective and make your voice heard on that. And one thing I will point out, so I spent most of my career as a lobbyist. I know it's a dirty word these days, but it's a fun way to make a living. What do lobbyists do? You go to Capitol Hill or your state capitol, and on behalf of clients, mostly companies or industries, you try and get people to do what you want legislatively or not do what you don't want legislatively. So I shifted out of that business when it became clear that government had become incredibly transparent, and there was all this data out there and no one was doing anything with the data to help understand policy developments. And one of the things that we realized is if you take everything that someone says and you graphically look at that, you can tell a lot about what they're actually thinking. A fairly common exercise, it's called a word cloud. So it works very well with politicians and policymakers and regulatory bodies because they will come and give a speech and say, who am I speaking to? Okay, great. Yes, I care about what you care about. It's awesome. Can I have $1,000? And everyone leaves the room and says, oh, that's great. That person really cares about what I care about. So we took it slightly differently, and we figured out a technological way to capture everything these policymakers say, not just their public speeches, but their press releases and everything else, and then say, what do they really care about? So the good news on postal reform is the postmaster really cares about postal reform. That is not a surprise, but there's actually a lot they could talk about that's not reform related. But they're actually walking the walk when it comes to caring about the issue. You can fight about what the resolution is, but there's an interest level. Then you get to Congress. So in Congress, there's two committees that have jurisdiction over postal reform issues, House Oversight and Government Reform, and the Senate Homeland Security and Government Reform Committee. You could stare at these all day long. You will not find the word postal. That is a problem. There's only one way to fix that problem. It is you all coming down to Washington and telling them they need to care about postal reform, especially since some of these folks happen to be the ones who now have jurisdiction over things like Hillary's email server. So if I'm going to have a hearing to make myself look good as a politician, which is what most hearings are all about, what would I rather talk about? I'd rather talk about Hillary's email server, and I'm pretty sure, frankly, many members of the Democratic Party would rather talk about other issues than postal reform. The only way that changes is if you guys call them and talk to them at home and go to Washington and say you have to do this or else X. And I don't mean or else X you're going to get thrown out of office, although you can certainly say that politely. Or else there's going to be a change in the business dynamic, in this case a change in how we market our materials, and that will have even more negative effects on an already fragile system. So again, I want to encourage you all to go down and make that comment. Internet sales tax. It's not really internet sales tax. There's so many different words for this issue now. There's Main Street fairness. None of them are actually what they are. We specialize in Washington in making up words for things that people don't want to talk about. I used to work on what was known as the estate tax. We wanted to repeal the estate tax. A really smart guy named Frank Luntz, who some of you may know, who specializes in the use of language in policy situations. Frank figured out that as long as we called it the estate tax, that only rich people have estates. And we needed to stop calling it the estate tax immediately. And we said, well, that's great, Frank, what should we call it? And he said, you call it the death tax, because everybody dies. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. We repealed the death tax 18 months later. We've been working on it for like 30 years. Now, it is a testament to the fact that language matters. This issue of, which is probably appropriately called remote sales tax, and relates to the underlying Supreme Court case known as Quill, that you need to have a nexus in order to tax, as states are under incredible pressure to find new revenue, and the world has changed in many ways in terms of how people acquire things these days, and our tax system may not have kept up with that. There have been a number of efforts in the last 4 years to enact something that would effectively toss out Quill and let everyone collect from everybody. That's a real problem. That could, I could show you the regular tax code, which is this big, and then I could pull something out that would be the 14,000 jurisdictions many of you would have to collect in should the current version of the Main Street Fairness Act pass. So here's where that stands right now, and then I'll tell you a couple other things about it. There is no bill in the House. The House of Representatives does not have a bill on this issue. Mr. Goodlatte, who's the chair of the committee that has jurisdiction now, has been talking about this issue for a long time. If I was cynical, I would say he has no intention of moving the bill. He's talking about it because as long as he talks about it, big retailers will continue to give him money, but that's probably too cynical, or maybe not enough. The House now has some principles which have been put out there, but again, no legislative language. On the Senate side, there has been a bill. There was a bill last Congress and it was voted on, and the same bill was introduced yesterday. Only this time, the Senate said, hey, by the way, we're not doing this again until the House goes first. So I know this drill from my own time in the Senate. This issue is what we used to call friend-on-friend violence. So if I'm a politician, chances are I know some big box retailers who really like this bill. And I know some other folks, including many in the anti-tax crowd, who really don't like this. So the easiest thing for me to do is nothing. Well, at a certain point last Congress in the Senate, the pressure was too much, and they said, okay, we're going to vote on it. And it was a fairly free vote, in that they knew the House wasn't going to move the bill. So they took a vote. And everyone yelled at them. Because your friends say, thank you for passing that bill, but your enemies are super pissed. So this time the Senate says, okay, great, we're going to introduce the bill again, same bill, but we are not voting on it until the House goes first, because I don't want them yelling at me. I want them yelling at you. So you, Mr. Goodlad, why don't you get out there with your principles and you try and pass a bill? So for those of us who don't think this bill is a very good idea, that logjam works in our favor. That being said, you still have some very powerful members of Congress who very much want to move this bill. And they are pushing all the time. And there are some rather large retailers with names that sound like Walmart who very much want this bill to pass and have spent a lot of money getting this bill to pass. And absent continued effort to change that dynamic and either make this issue go away or look at our tax system in a way that's not an undue burden on everybody else, we're going to have to keep fighting on this. Now, again, we did our little word cloud exercise to look at the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, the House Judiciary Committee, and which has jurisdiction, and said, I know Bob Goodlatte talks about this, but how much is remote sales tax really on his radar screen? And much like postal, the answer is not a lot. Now, you can attribute that to a number of different things. One, there's other stuff that is fairly easy for them to do. They just did a human trafficking bill. Not a lot of people showed up to lobby in favor of human trafficking. So I can almost guarantee you're a hero when you move the human trafficking bill. If you move a tax bill of any kind, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to tick off 49% of the room if you're really lucky. So it's not a huge surprise. But it also means that they're not hearing from enough people. So again, I come back to, you all have to engage. And I will put in a direct plug. I made Paul stand up earlier, but one of those opportunities for engagement is in April, the ACMA Policy Forum. And Dana mentioned that he walked around on Capitol Hill with me at a previous one of those. I cannot emphasize enough how powerful it is when you all show up. Hired gun lobbyists are really good. We can call people we used to work for and say, hey, you should do this. And here's why you should do it. But at the end of the day, those lobbyists don't get to vote for those folks, and you all do. So when you say, hey, by the way, I'm from Knoxville, and I employ 700 people, and we're considering expanding, and if you do this, not only am I not expanding in this state because your tax rules would make this really burdensome and bad for me, I'm going to tell all 700 people what a jerk you are for voting the wrong way. Because you're hurting the company and therefore hurting them. Trust me, that gets their attention far more than the best hired gun lobbyist ever could. Not only are you much more powerful than the hired gun lobbyist, but you have a real story. You can actually say, oh, well, here's how this would work. I now have to withhold for 14,000 jurisdictions. Here's what that would mean to my operational day-to-day life. Here's why that would really make me not very competitive next to this guy who's just over the border in this other state with a very favorable tax structure, and why shouldn't we all move over there? So I need you all to come to Washington and tell that story. And tell it back home. I know there are a number of you who know you're a member of Congress. If you employ hundreds of people in someone's congressional district, you don't need to hire a lobbyist to get your member of Congress to talk to you. I wouldn't have admitted that when I was just a shoe leather lobbyist, but now I can. You can get that meeting on your own. You might need to hire a lobbyist to help you strategize about it, but you employ hundreds or thousands of people or have a brand name, as many of you do that are literally household names, you can call that member of Congress and say, I want him to call me back. I want him to come visit my facility and I want to talk about this issue. And he or she will come and they will listen. Now they might, at the end of the day, still go the other way. But I can guarantee you, if you do not do that, it will not go the way you want it to. You cannot kind of free ride on these issues. Postal reform, remote sales tax, these are really competitive issues. Privacy, one we didn't talk about. I'm not sure how many of you, at the end of the day, are lying in bed at night worried about privacy legislation coming out of the federal government. I will tell you, whether it's next year's meeting or the meeting the year after, I guarantee you will be talking about it. because every time there's a breach, we get a little bit closer to legislation. And the legislation is going to be something along the lines of, when a breach happens, and all of you, everyone in this room, some of you, that is literally what you do, you manage data for other people. Even those of you who don't, your customer list is that data. They are going to ultimately pass legislation that's going to say, when that happens, here's whose fault it is, and here's who's going to pay. And it's far easier to make all of you pay than to make the people someplace else pay. So you need to engage on that issue as well. Fortunately, that issue is not quite ripe enough yet, notwithstanding that we've had all these data breaches, and it's getting there. But again, you do not have the luxury on these issues of just saying, okay, I'm going to go sell widgets, and maybe I'll send a letter. You truly need to engage on these, because I know from talking to many of you directly, from representing people like you over the years, these issues are real and have a bottom line consequence. If you wake up and postal rates are 2x, it will have changed your behavior. If you wake up and they say, yeah, you are collecting for 14,000 jurisdictions, it will change your bottom line and change your behavior. None of those will be in the positive. So again, thank you. I'm happy to take questions about the policy issues, about the politics, about Hillary's email, any of those. Questions?
Is it true that it's servers at the bottom of the Potomac?
So when I went to work in politics, I was a lawyer, and the first person that I was working for was former Vice President Dan Quayle. And when you're someone's lawyer, you get to know them really well. Because politicians, and I don't know if there are any corporate general counsels in the room, but politicians tend to use their lawyer the same way that CEOs use their general counsels, which is, you're certainly there for the corporate piece, but you also get called in for anything else, right? Someone's kid gets in trouble, anything else, you're the lawyer, and you're going to be asked to, so you know everything. So after working for a number of politicians, I knew everything about everybody. Most of it bad, because you don't call your lawyer unless it's pretty bad. And my dad said, you should publish a book. And I said, yeah, that would breach my attorney-client privilege. Oh, yeah, that's right. He said, well, you should keep a diary. And I was like, no, that'd be a very bad idea. The most remarkable piece of the email thing so far is the assertion that I went through it and I decided what was personal and I deleted the other 30,000. I know from my own experience and a number of investigations and subpoenas and other things, none of it's deleted. Even if they think it's deleted, it's not deleted. It's a bad fact for her to say, I deleted 30,000 emails. It would be a really problematic fact if she said, the server's gone. We tossed it. I'm pretty sure it's in her closet in Chapel, which is where they ran the server out. I hope for her sake that it's no longer plugged into the wall, because I can also tell you that every hacker in America, if they have not already, are trying desperately to get in. And because her address is publicly known, it's actually not that hard to hack apparently, because you know what the various data drops are at that location. So I doubt if it's sitting at the bottom of the Potomac. It is one of those situations where there's no good outcome. Had she thrown the server into the Potomac 4 years ago, that would have been an acceptable answer and resolved a lot of these problems. But I'm pretty sure it's sitting in a closet. My immediate reaction when this story broke was, we're like days away from someone going to court and saying, I want the emails. My expectation was it was some kind of conservative group and they'd throw it off. It was the AP. The AP is not some conservative hack who's trying to make Hillary look bad. The AP has now gone to court and said, we want all the emails. So a judge is going to decide. And my guess is a number of judges are going to decide. And then Congress is going to subpoena the server. And she's going to say no. I will not give it up to Congress. And then they will go to court, and then they will go to the Supreme Court. And all of this will take months and months and months and months, when she was supposed to be talking about how she was going to change the world and break the glass ceiling forever. And instead, she'll be talking about whether it is at the bottom of the Potomac or not. But I don't think it is.
Who do you think the most likely small group of Republicans who could potentially be the nominee are?
So the two people that I think from a historical who Republicans tend to like and who has the mechanisms in place to run for president, right now would be Jeb Bush and Scott Walker. So two things. You always need at least two people to run for president. You need the person who's ultimately going to win, and you need their foil so that there's someone for them to run against. People forget that even George W. Bush, who had this amazing roll to victory, he had to beat Steve Forbes, who also had a whole lot of money. So this time you're going to have Jeb, who may raise near term $100 million, which from a presidential perspective, I'll try and put that in perspective. So it used to be pre-08 that presidential campaigns took matching funds from the federal government, little box on your taxes you can check, doesn't cost you anything, you give $4 to the matching fund. In 1998, my old boss, Dan Quayle, thought about running for president. And he got me and a bunch of guys in a room and said, I'm thinking about this, what will it cost? And with a totally straight face, and looking at all the data from every other presidential campaign in history, I said, well, if we raise 17 million, we will have 26 million after the matching funds, and money will not be an issue. And I was totally serious. And I was right, based on historical data. You couldn't get to the Iowa straw poll on $50 million these days, and I'm pretty sure Jeb will bank $100 million before the primary is actually in effect. He has reportedly told major donors who have the ability to raise more than $1 million for him to stop at $1 million, because he doesn't want it to look like just a few rich people are funding the campaign. So he has almost universal name ID. Yes, I get that cuts both ways, but if you're running against a Clinton, you can actually say your name is Bush, and he will have effectively unlimited resources. And Scott Walker, because what he has done relative to unions in the state is incredibly attractive to a very broad cross-section of the Republican base. It cuts across many of those divides that have blown the party up in recent history, number one. Number two, he's young, he's fairly charismatic, and he's a governor. And we like governors. It is very hard to get elected president, notwithstanding Mr. Obama's success, as a legislator. And that's especially true for folks like Rick Santorum, who are not even legislators anymore. They were legislators. So for folks like that to get on the stage and talk about what they will do as a chief executive, Americans generally like to say, oh, well, this guy was a chief executive, and here's what he did. So to me, the people with the clearest path are Scott Walker and Jeb. Marco Rubio, I get asked about a lot. I know Senator Rubio, I think really highly of him. I don't think he's ready, number one. Number two, Jeb Bush creates a serious problem for him. One of the great upsides to being a Floridian when you run for president is you have access to this amazing donor base. But when someone even more well-known to the same donor base shows up and kind of jumps in front of you and takes all the money, that's a real problem. So, other questions?
Do you think that Senator Ron Johnson will take a different position on postal reform than now that he's chairman, as opposed to when he was just on the committee? Because he was real problematic.
Yes. Is there anyone here related to Senator Johnson, or can I speak for you? Okay. It's not just postal. He is really cantankerous. I think it's part of his shtick. Everyone has a shtick as a politician. Part of his shtick is being cantankerous. I had gone in to see him with people who were going in to tell him that they supported bills he introduced, and he yelled at them. And I was like, no, I think you misunderstood. They like what you did, and they're here to say thank you. And you're still yelling at me. I do not expect him to suddenly become sunshine and roses. on postal or any other issue. But life is different when you are the chairman than when you are not. There is a lot of speculation that he doesn't like the Senate. I don't think he does like the Senate. I think a lot of people get elected from the business world and think it's one thing, and they get there and they realize it's not, and they're just killing 6 or 12 years until they can go do whatever they're going to do because they find the entire legislative process beneath them and not very fun or dynamic. I don't think he's really enjoying his time in the Senate, which is one of the reasons he's tough on us on all issues, including postal. That actually weighs in our favor in this case because he didn't become chairman because he really wanted to be chairman. He became chairman because on the Republican side it's raw seniority, and he was next in line for that particular slot. So when you have a somewhat unengaged chairman, many times what that means is they look to the rest of the committee and say, I really don't care. And I'm kind of against everything. You want to run with postal? Have at it. We did have a kind of unique moment with the past ranking member and chair who seemed to genuinely like each other, notwithstanding a whole lot of differences on almost everything, which probably will not exist with Mr. Johnson. But I don't think that it's dispositive on how postal moves ahead.
Yeah, so most sales tax, two strategies. Try to paralyze it, or try to support, perhaps compromise legislation that may be more acceptable. Which strategy, and if B, how can you get aligned about with that, to get that right legislation written?
So, a couple of things. I believe a just kill it strategy sometimes is really important, right? Sometimes there's an issue that is so black or white, there is truly no ambiguity, and the answer is, no, we just need this not to happen. And in the pantheon of things that people try and get done, killing things is actually relatively easy, and therefore that becomes an attractive option. In my conversations with people, even people who really don't like at all the Main Street Fairness bill will say, now we could be for something if it was like this. I think there is enough of that conversation going on that it makes sense to talk about what a compromise bill would be. Now, that being said, you have to be very careful in the legislative world when you play that game. Why is that? Because some parts of it are fairly open, and you have opportunities along the way to say, whoa, we're definitely not for that. This is taking a turn we did not see, and we want out. We want to stop it. But there are other points in the legislative process where the train has effectively left the station, and it's not stopping at these other places, and your objection is no longer going to be heard. The danger in this particular process is, okay, if they get to a conference committee, right? Let's say the Senate moves a bill that no one in this room likes. We're like, that bill's awful. And let's say Mr. Goodlatte moves a bill, which I know is not the case, but that you all say, we can live with that. Let's get to conference and we'll work it out. That's really dicey, because you will not be in the room. There will be no lobbyists in the room. They will go in there, and Dick Durbin and Bob Goodlatte are going to hash it out. And it can go horribly sideways, and then it's done. And this is the kind of bill that if it gets through the legislative process, it will be signed into law. The president is not going to veto a remote sales tax bill, unless Republicans attach, no guns in post office cars or something. I still believe that it makes sense to engage in that conversation, and that we are still at a point in the process where we can both engage on a substantive basis and still register strenuous objection with certain bills, and reserve our right to be absolutely in favor of nothing and just try and kill it. Other questions?
So a little off topic, but tax related. What do you think the reality of actually doing any sort of tax reform is? in the legislation?
So the one tax thing that I didn't mention that a lot of you will care about is something that came up last year in the early tax reform conversations, which was a fairly broad-based advertising tax. And it was theoretically drawn in such a way that it would truly change the world of marketing, because all kinds of costs that are currently tax expensed a certain way would not be able to cost all of you a whole lot of money. The only reason I didn't talk about it today is I believe that tax reform will, no tax-related provisions are going to move outside of comprehensive tax reform. So why is that? Number one, once you get into a process of trying to move big, complicated bills, and believe me, tax reform, there is nothing bigger or more complicated. There's a reason we last did it in 1986, is there's some fairly low-hanging fruit. And I will give you some examples of the low-hanging fruit. So, carried interest. How many people here know what carried interest is? So if this was a hedge fund conference, almost all of you would know what carried interest is, because it means that you all are effectively taxed on what we would all consider income at a capital gains rate. That's really good for you. It's very hard to explain to ordinary Americans why you should only be paying 20-something and they're paying more. When we do tax reform, that's going away. So why isn't that just going away now? And the answer is it is low-hanging fruit, and it's going to generate $27 billion. And when we do tax reform, there's going to be some other stuff we want to pay for, and we want to keep that so that we can force the members to vote for us. We are now at a point in the process where everything needs to stay together so we can do the whole thing. Now what that means is, well, I'm going to say this. We now have the people in place to do tax reform. Getting Paul Ryan as Ways and Means Chairman was incredibly significant. I'm sure there are people who are disappointed he doesn't want to run for president. He's a great person and would be a good president. He doesn't want to be president. He's a tax geek. He's a policy person, and he actually wants to reform the tax code. I'm sure there's some deep, dark flaw in his upbringing that made him feel that way, but I think it's actually a good thing, so our tax system probably needs to be redone. We now have the people who want to do it, who are going to be there for a while. You also have Mr. Camp, the last chair of the Ways and Means Committee before he retired, did what's known as the Camp draft. So he put a whole lot of this stuff down on paper and said, I know we're not going to get it done this year, but here's what I think. And the reason that's important is it allowed Republicans to get some of these issues out there, to be able to talk about them, socialize them with the business community without having to have their own butts on the line, because they're like, hey Dave, you're retiring, so why don't you do it? You put it out there, then we can talk about taking away people's deductions for the use of corporate jets and all this other stuff that we know we need to do, but we don't want to be the ones to say it. So you have a number of those set pieces out there. I think we are on a path for tax reform. It is very hard to do tax reform in a presidential year. It's generally not the kind of thing you're going to, again, friend-on-friend violence, right? I cannot cut your taxes without raising yours in an environment where we're talking about revenue neutrality, which is probably what we're looking at. Now, two things. What does that ultimately look like, and timing? So timing, I think it's past the presidential election. If it was me, it would be the first year of the new presidency, regardless of who wins. What does it look like? I think you're going to have a president standing in the Rose Garden with a bunch of CEOs next to him, or her. And they're going to say, I just signed into law the biggest reduction in the corporate tax rate in our country's history. And I took 7 points, 8 points, 9 points off the corporate rate in the CEO. And there'll be a bunch of CEOs who are not there, who were back at headquarters in a really bad mood with their CFO. So the winners are going to be companies with most of their revenue generated in the United States. You will go from your current corporate tax rate to -5, 6, 7, whatever it is, and you will not have to give up a lot to get that. The people who are going to get hammered are people who do a tremendous amount of business overseas and have used the current tax structure legally, I might add, to their advantage to do things like park their IP offshore or keep several $1 billion in an Irish bank or invert and make Switzerland their corporate headquarters even though the entire company's leadership lives in Boston. Because those advantages are going to go away. And the money they get from that, they're going to give to all the US revenue companies with a lower rate. And politically that works. As a policy matter, every individual company is going to have to sit there with their CFO and say, does this work for us or not? But that's a 18 to 24 month process. I would encourage people and their CFOs to not sit around for 2 years and say, well, we'll see what the bill looks like. I could sit down with your CFO right now and go line by line through any of your companies and say, this is going to change, this is going to change, this is going to change, and here's what it's probably going to look like. If you care about those issues, you need to have that conversation now. You cannot show up at the last minute on tax reform and say, hey, this advertising tax, that would be a really bad idea. Because even though I think it's going to be 18 to 24 months to get a bill, these conversations that people are having on tax reform, the one that Dave Camp started last year, that is a live fire exercise. And those set pieces will form the basis of whatever tax reform ultimately looks like. And the public fight between Republicans and Democrats will be over revenue neutrality. The idea that if we cut taxes, there has to be you have to do something with the money and no more. Right? Republicans want a net cut. They want to cut taxes and not spend anymore. Democrats are like, great, we'll cut taxes, but where are we going to get this revenue? We have to jack up someone else's because the revenue has to stay the same. In fact, we'd like more money because there's some more stuff we want to do. That's what the fight's going to be about. And if you're sitting around talking about an advertising tax or depreciation rules, they're going to look at you and say, where were you 2 years ago? We did this deal with Dave Camp. You're going to be like, Dave Camp's not even in Congress anymore. And they're going to say, I know, it's fantastic. So anyway, that's my take on tax reform.
Yeah, first of all, I want to reiterate your thought of having people in this room go down to Congress. I know that some people have. I went down, and I'm a consultant, I went down with a number of CEOs during the first Vogel reform a number of years ago, meeting with a number of senators and representatives. We know a lot of their aides write the legislation, but they asked some really good questions about, what the impact was, and we could take them through, 10-minute, 15-minute, half-hour meeting, and really open their eyes as to what the impact was to our respective businesses. So I strongly encourage you to work with the ACMA or any other organization, just as you said, and either meet with your representative here in the state or go down to Washington with a group of 5 or 10 people and get your point across. It really hits home.
And I will add something on that because you mentioned meeting with the aides. So sometimes people come, especially the first time, and they say, this is great. Are we meeting with, I'm from Massachusetts, are we meeting with Elizabeth Warren? And the lobbyist says, no. Elizabeth Warren is meeting with the Sultan of Brunei right now, and you're going to meet with this kid who looks like they're 19 years old. And many times, corporate executives look at the kid and look at the lobbyist and say, this is a total waste of my time. That kid is the one making the decision. They will tell you, well, I appreciate your concern, and I will certainly pass that along to Senator Warren and share your concerns. I have been that staffer. I have been the senior staffer, and as was mentioned, I'm married to a politician. I can tell you there's too much going on for members to make these decisions themselves, and most decisions are made because your aide comes to you and says, okay, let's talk postal. Here's who we've heard from, here's what I think. And 9 times out of 10, the member says, okay, great, that's what I think. So that kid who looks like they're 19, they're actually 23, but they look like they're 19, that meeting is really important. Really, really important. In fact, it is just as important as meeting with the member. Maybe more so, because I can guarantee you the 23-year-old will listen, and the politician, while older and more impressive, I can almost guarantee you that they're not listening even when they're looking right at you and you're talking. Because they're politicians and they do this like 400 times a day, right? They're like, I got you, totally with you. And then they walk out and they're like, I don't even know what that was about. And then look at the young aide and say, remind me what that was about and how I'm supposed to vote. So.
work for a Maine-based company that's going to actually have both of our senators in our store in Washington, D.C. next week, and it's for a grand opening celebration. So my question is that the type of forum that's appropriate to engage in these discussions? And to follow up on that, what does that engagement that you're talking about look like? Is it send a letter and you're done? Is it go visit once and you're done? Or is it something that should happen over time?
A two-part question. Is something like that an appropriate venue for policy engagement? Yes. Absolutely yes. I would actually go beyond that. There is no time, with the exception of maybe a funeral, that is not an appropriate time to collar your member of Congress if you're with them and raise policy issues. This is what they do for a living. They're certainly not going to say, I can't believe you used the opportunity of you opening a store and me trying to get some reflected glory off your brand to talk to me about an issue that's actually going to affect the bottom line and determine whether we open more of these stores and employ more people back home. So, overwhelming, yes. That is a phenomenal opportunity. In fact, that's a better opportunity than going to see them in their office. Because then you're tying those two things together. Those politicians are coming to your opening for the reason that I said. They want to bask in the glory of the fact that you're creating jobs for people in their state. So there is no better time for you or someone else from the company to say, hey, by the way, really appreciate you being here. Can I talk to you for 90 seconds about this Main Street Fairness Act? Let me tell you what a horrible idea that is. And here's what we'd really like to see, and here's what our concerns are. So, A, that's a great opportunity. B, is writing a letter enough? No. Writing a letter is important. Their technology has made it very easy for people to reach out electronically. And this is a problem for society writ large. It's a problem in government even more so. So here's how it used to work. It used to be people corresponded with their members of Congress through phone calls and letters. And then 9/11 happened. And you can't send mail to Congress anymore. Well, you can, but it goes to a special mail sorting facility where they irradiate it for ricin and cut the corners of the envelopes off to make sure there's no powder in it, and then cook it in an oven to kill anything else. And it literally shows up weeks and months later. And all the white paper has turned this weird brown color and it smells funky. Mail is no longer a great way to correspond with members of Congress or their staffs. Phone calls are a good way because they are cataloged. So if you call your member of Congress and say, I'd like to talk to Senator so-and-so. Oh, I'm sorry, he or she's not available right now. Can I take a message? And again, there's some 22-year-old kid sitting there, and you might think, well, what good was that? What were you calling about? Well, I was calling to register my concerns about the Main Street Fairness Act. Okay, great. That person sits there and goes, this person against Main Street Fairness Act. Why don't I connect you to the staffer who handles that issue? Okay, great. Then you talk to that person. So they catalog all the phone calls. When there's a vote, members will say, hey, by the way, what are the phones doing on that? Now, this is where emails created a real mess, in that it's very easy now for advocacy organizations to send a blast to all their members and say, click here and it will automatically generate a letter. What that has meant is you basically had advocacy inflation. So before you'd be like, hey, this is a big deal, 27 people have called. Now you're like, we got 300,000 emails this morning on the ammunition ban. Okay, most of whom aren't from our state or our district, so it gets a little hard. All of that is to say, there is no one way to do it, but it is certainly true that you should not limit yourself to writing a letter or a phone call. You should call. You should invite them to visit your facility back home. You should go see them in Washington. And you should continue and continue and continue. It will pay not only dividends in the micro sense that you'll say, hey, that's great. That my congressman voted the way I wanted to, and we actually turned that issue. So that's fantastic. It will pay much larger dividends in that there are policy issues that I guarantee you we're not thinking of right now because they haven't happened yet. And 4 years from now, there'll be some other issue. And if you're really good at it, they will call you and say, hey, by the way, what do you guys think of this? You're in this business. Is this going to affect you? So that's when you've broken all the way through the back wall. But you only get that way from calls and meetings and letters. I'm always profoundly surprised within a corporate entity that I'm working with. I always want to talk to them about, well, how many people here already know these policymakers? And a bunch of executives will be like, I do. We're in the same country club, and someone else is like, well, I go to church with this. And I'm like, you already know them? Have you talked to them about any of the issues? Well, no. So you will find many people at your company who are already engaged, and you're just not taking advantage of it. They're not taking advantage of it. I'm not in any way encouraging you to run around your facility saying, who knows Bob Goodlad? But I do think that a multidisciplinary approach, whereby you reach out through your trade association, you reach out through your company, you reach out through your executives, you reach out through electronic media, you call, all of the above. Right? They are consumers. You want to reach them in as many ways as possible.
Great. I think this could probably go on all afternoon. This has been great. Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you.